Widowmaker. It means something that kills. Dangerous, reckless, and wicked devices that only the brave go near. Machines that have taken the lives of legends.
John Wolfe didn't survive.
That are so downright difficult to wield. They terrify even the most brave among us. And yet, we keep making them. As if our brains are wired this way. The allure of commanding something capable of destroying us drives us on. An animal instinct within some of us to push the envelope until it tears. To dance with the shadowy figure of our own demise. A dark voice in the back of our head. That when we ride that bleeding edge, it tells us, go further. From the first brave souls that took to the skies in hastily assembled aircraft, explorers that braved the open seas in search of new horizons, to the dreamers that first left the atmosphere of our own Earth, we push on. Today, computers and sensors help us go faster, go further, without fear, in control. But in 1975, we had only our hands and feet to guide us. And Porsche decided to give us a tool of our own annihilation. A double-edged sword. A machine that required your utmost attention. To tame its raw power, you needed grit, technique, and bravery. And it was worth it. This was the Widowmaker, the 930 Turbo. Chuck Yaeger was the first human being to hurtle across the sound barrier. He did it piloting the Bell X-1. Piloting is a word I'm using generously here. The X-1 was nothing more than a rocket modeled after a .50 caliber bullet. His odds of success were, well, let's just say there were a lot of death pools for early test pilots. Yet, it was Yaeger's respect for his own mortality that kept him above ground. No one else was as aware of the danger posed by flight, and that knowledge made him study and adapt constantly in order to gingerly step forward, over the understood limits of humanity. Scientists at the time didn't know what would happen at supersonic speeds. They thought the air pressure might just rip the plane apart, or that the pressure wave created would obliterate nearby homes. But the call of the void was too great. They had to know. And above the California desert in 1947, that sound barrier was broken.
Crack the sound barrier.
Brave, or stupid, or both, Chuck Yaeger became the first person to travel over Mach 1. A mere 7 years later, the US was already trying for Mach 2. And yet again, it was Chuck Yaeger that climbed into the flying coffin known as the XF-104 Starfighter. To underline how courageous this was, he was piloting the third Starfighter. The first two had already crashed. And the third fared no better. Chuck survived the incident, and went on to do something safer like fly for NASA. The US, on the other hand, had wars to win. And a new, high-altitude interceptor could help turn the tides of battle. They wanted their new jet now, so they put it into production without a second thought.
The premiere of a new star blazing in the sky.
In 1958, the F-104 Starfighter entered service. A jet meant only to do two things: get very high and go very fast. A rapid response jet, capable of getting to the fight and leaving it before its rivals. It broke records for altitude, climb rate, and speed, and was adopted by almost every major military air force in its short lifespan. But most importantly, it instilled a healthy fear into every one of its pilots. In the German Luftwaffe, its reputation was notorious. To fly one was akin to playing Russian roulette. You see, it was designed only with speed in mind, not safety. It had dangerously thin wings that were pushed far to the back of its frame. It didn't carry a lot of fuel, and it couldn't turn very hard. And it was terrifying to land because if you got too slow, it would simply fall out of the damn sky. It was such a dangerous and difficult beast to tame, the Germans lost over 200 of them to accidents, taking the lives of over 100 pilots, earning it the now infamous title of Widowmaker. A tool as deadly to its operator as it is to its enemies. Although the stakes are never as high as in war, the racetrack is a very real battlefield, where competitors have to fight for every inch, and in many cases, failure carries the same consequence.
We all have a desire to create something that will show we were here and did something of value. To create something timeless.
Enter Porsche, who is no stranger to war. They are, after all, a company founded in Germany prior to 1935. And like nearly all companies who forged weapons for combat, after the war they found a home in automobiles and racing. In the 60s, they found themselves standing toe-to-toe with Ferrari and Ford, even stealing a win from the Blue Oval in Le Mans with the legendary 917. By 1972, Porsche was well on its way to becoming the king of motorsports. They were a household name in Le Mans, Rally, GTP, and had entered the infamous Canadian-American Challenge Series. At the helm of their Can-Am car was a driver named George Fulmer, who legend has it was incapable of ever being serious. What was serious though was the car he was tasked with piloting. It was dubbed Turbo Panzer, or 917/10. It was an 1100 horsepower demon based on the Le Mans winning 917. The 917-10 had a bigger engine and an even bigger turbo. For his first race, Fulmer was handed the keys to the 917-10 at a Can-Am race at Road Atlanta. Fulmer had never driven the 917-10. He'd also never driven at Road Atlanta. Oh shit was about all he could muster to say before he took the challenge. Despite his misgivings, he and the 917-10 would bring home the gold, and essentially ruin Can-Am forever. Seriously, the Can-Am Association effectively banned the 917-10 specifically, then stopped running the race entirely. The end of Can-Am racing left a turbo-shaped hole in Porsche's heart though, so they set their sights on the Grand Touring Championship in Group 4. And Group 4 meant homologation, meaning if a car was going to be raced, hundreds needed to be sold to the public. An unsuspecting public that was about to witness a beast that refused to be tamed.
Performance, practicality, and value.
The choice was clear. The 911 was already the perfect sports car, the chassis already tuned to perfection. It just wasn't fast enough. Porsche's solution was to pull the 3.0-liter engine from the Carrera RS, their most powerful engine of the time. And a wise man, Dr. Ernst Fuhrmann, decided, fuck it, let's turbocharge it. Give it massive power. Consequences be damned. It was one of the least Porsche things Porsche has ever done, and it was excellent. The new power proved too much for the 911's chassis at the time, so Porsche widened the rear axles to try to keep it in check. It wasn't enough, so they fashioned a new engine cover with a massive wing providing more downforce. It wasn't enough. They stiffened the suspension, added bigger brakes. It wasn't enough. They employed a more durable 4-speed transmission rather than using a more fragile 5-speed of the time. They did everything they could to tame this new wild monster, and it wasn't enough. In 1975, they gave the green light to release their new child to the ill-prepared masses. They called it the 911 Turbo, and it was fast. much like the starfighter screaming overhead. The 930T was little more than a monster of an engine with just enough control to give you the illusion of being in charge, and it was like nothing else at the time. The muscle car was dead.
1970 442.
Even the Corvette had around 200 horsepower. Japan was still a sleeping giant. There alone was this turbocharged monstrosity, poised to blow the competition away. It was immediately adopted by driving enthusiasts, who were tenderly stepping out and acquiring 930s of their own. Mario Andretti, Walter Roll, Jackie Eakes, all 930 turbo owners, and all Chuck Yaegers in their own right.
And this is it, the very latest 911 Turbo. Not my choice of colour perhaps, but that doesn't detract from these classic 911 lines.
Fear is an emotion that comes from understanding, an understanding of the danger you're in, because that respect, that fear keeps you alive. Walter Roll, a World Rally Championship driver, the tertiary equivalent of an Air Force veteran, still considered the 930 a challenge to drive. His day job had him piloting Group B cars, but the early turbo Porsche proved to be a handful even in the hands of an expert. The 930 Turbo was the fastest German car in production in 1975. It was a rocket bred for racing, sold to regular consumers out of necessity. It became just as much of a status symbol off the track as it was on. Everyone from dentists to business tycoons to hockey stars wanted one. What they didn't know was that many of them would come to regret it, or worse. Creating machines that propel us to new limits while staying in control and keeping us alive is a monumental task. Now, a lesson in physics. The Porsche 911's engine is in the back, not the middle, the full rear. Anyone remember the Corvair? It was deemed unsafe at any speed. Here's a little known secret. Porsches had the same problem. Rear engine, lightweight, and too much power. That means if you don't know what you're doing, you go for a ride. Feel a little oversteer mid-corner and decide to lift off that throttle out of panic? You just fuck up. The weight transfers forward off the drive wheels and you spin. Hopefully not near a cliff or into oncoming traffic. And that's without the turbo. When you add a turbo to this recipe, a big, slow-to-spool turbo, that is nothing like the smooth twin turbo systems that we're used to nowadays, you get fooled by a lack of power as you sit in the low revs. And then it hits you. The turbo spools up around 3,000 or 4,000 RPMs, and you end up getting pulled into the back of your seat. A surprise burst of power from an engine moments before that was putting you to sleep. And all of this while you're trying to keep a notoriously hard to control car pointed straight. The danger of that big turbo cannot be overstated. Before the boost builds, the 930 is a tame old sports car that doesn't like you. It doesn't want to do what it's told, and it can barely get out of its own way. Then, after what feels like an eternity, the boost comes on, and your sluggish coupe becomes a starfighter hurtling towards the sound barrier. If that power spike hits mid-turn, you can't lift or you'll spin out. Do you have the moxie to ride it out? To keep that foot planted? Counter-steering the massive unbalanced weight of the rear swinging around on you? That kind of driving takes racing drivers years to master. But this wasn't a race car. This was a normal sports car sold to any idiot with enough money. It was akin to selling a tank to a casual hunter, or an F-14 Tomcat to a drone pilot. Like anything else so close to the edge, it only takes a minor mistake to send you over. Now, does that stop anyone? Ha! Of course not. It didn't stop the husband of Cynthia Files. He bought his 930 Turbo and loaned it to his wife one day for work. After a few drinks, she gunned the 930 off of a stoplight, trying to impress her boss in the passenger seat. The turbo spooled up and pulled her to the back of her seat. Terrifying Cynthia, she hit the brakes before a slight turn. The rear end rotated and her boss was killed in the ensuing accident with oncoming traffic. The following legal case was record-breaking. Porsche was made to pay out $2.5 million in damages, setting a precedent for drivers suing car makers for irresponsibly made cars. The body count for Porsche kept piling up. Another driver hit a telephone pole, hockey star Pelle Lindbergh ended up in the kinetic barrier.
On a respirator when his Porsche crashed.
Porsche was forced to finally acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, Handing an ill-tempered race car to the idiot masses was a bad idea. As a result, Porsche has offered performance driving classes to anyone who buys their most dangerous cars. And while the media blamed Porsche, just like they blamed the Corvair, or the MR2 later, the truth is always the same. We still want them, these fatal machines. We humans want to try our hands at harnessing the uncontrollable. How many times have we witnessed the same story? The Carrera GT picked up the same Widowmaker moniker 30 years later, after throwing more than a few experienced drivers for a ride. And while Porsche may seem to have a knack for killing its customers, they certainly aren't alone. The Dodge Viper, the Shelby Cobra, anything that was ever made by TVR. The truth is, every car manufacturer wants to be like Porsche, pushing the boundaries of what's possible, redefining the limits of performance, and subsequently, what is safe. Rarely, though, are they brave enough to do it. Time and time again, Porsche has shown us they are willing to create a hammer too heavy to wield, a blade so sharp it cuts both ways, weapons so powerful they should never be employed. We can argue about whether or not it was smart for the 930 to be trusted in human hands, but we cannot argue with its raw power. A once-in-a-lifetime machine that bent the rules, pushed past what was capable, and gave us something unforgettable. It's human nature that when we see the very limits of what we're capable of, when rules are laid out in front of us, be they laws of physics or assertions of men, it is human will to break those rules. It is in our nature to be limitless.